Hi. Yes, welcome back. And this is the last session, and I hope we can use this last hour also for a more interactive debate and not long statements. I'm not Paul Timmers. So Paul is ill, unfortunately. He's in Oxford. And so Lorenzo has asked me to moderate instead. My name is Wolfgang Kleinwachter. I'm a retired professor from the University of Aarhus in Denmark, but I'm a German, and I was also a member of the ICANN board and a commissioner in the Global Commission on Stability in Cyberspace together with Olaf, who is one of our panelists. We have now 3 panelists. Olaf is from the Internet Society. We have Andrea Rigoni from the EU Cyber and Digital Policy and from Deloitte. And then we have Clement Perarnaud, researcher at the university, the Free University of Brussels and CEPS, and he has just recently co-authored a report on for the European Parliament on internet fragmentation. So as Lorenzo has said, the second part of this wonderful summit looks into the future, and I hope that the future will see light at the end of the tunnel, and this light will be the morning sun of the Garden Eden and not the light of the incoming train. So let's wait and see, how will this, what the future will be. In our panel, we have the title of the panel is Cybersecurity Global Governance in the New World Order. That means we have 3 issues. And I would start to raise 3 dilemmas for all the 3 issues. I think the dilemma in cybersecurity is that when we deal with new technology, we are dealing with new complexities. And we know that from many other areas that a growing complexity makes the windows of vulnerability bigger. So I think this is a dilemma we have to face. If it comes to global governance, we have a dilemma in the internet. We have the transport layer where we have this one world, one internet, and we have ICANN, which manages the domain name system, and everybody, all the 5 billion internet users are using this IP protocols, the IP address system. So this enables that 5 billion people can communicate to 5 billion people. But on the application layer, we have this one world, 193 jurisdictions. So that means in every country, they are looking to regulate internet-related public policy issues, and the dilemma is the relationship between the 2 layers. So the dreamers of the 1990s had the idea that the one world, one internet from the transport layer will influence the application layer, and we get a harmonized world also on the application layer. So the risk today, what I see is, and Olaf will talk a little bit more about this later, is that the application layer will go down to the transport layer and will have effects to the one world, one internet philosophy of the technical infrastructure. And in the new world order, what we see now is indeed that the borders between real war and cyber war are blurring. So I think we had the idea, and it was mentioned this morning, that a cyber war is a special thing. So the old war was, a kinetic war with death and destruction, and the new war is with chaos and confusion and cyber attacks. So this has remembered me on the 1990s when we talked about the new economy, that there's a new economy, an old economy, but finally we learned there's only one economy, but the economy is more and more digitalized. And if it comes to war and peace, we could say, so there is no new war and old war. So a war is a war is a war, but the war gets more and more digitalized or cyber. That means, unfortunately, we have now everything: death, destruction, chaos, and confusion. So this is the reality of the war in the 21st century. So this is the dilemma we have here, that peacetime and wartime are more and more difficult to separate. So how to deal with the dilemmas? And I start with Olaf, because on the one hand, we see also the European Commission and member states of the European Union who want to strengthen European sovereignty. Digital sovereignty is a catchword, and the intention is very good. They want to enhance cybersecurity, but is it really the right way to strengthen cybersecurity, and what are the unintended side effects? Olaf.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, Olaf Kolkman. I work for the Internet Society, and at the Internet Society, we care about the digital world, but we care about one aspect of the digital world, namely the Internet. Because I think that the Internet is sort of the foundation of making the digital society, the digital world, all our interactions work. And as Wolfgang already sort of eloquently described, is that in the Internet architecture, you have this network of networks that provide connectivity, that all the applications and services that we humans get value from are using. Now, I'm going to put one nuance on what Wolfgang just said, that in the name of digital sovereignty, all kinds of cybersecurity issues are made. That's not exactly the case. We just published a report which is called Navigating Digital Sovereignty and Its Impact on the Internet. If you want to find it, the best way to find it is to actually Google for the title, Navigating Digital Sovereignty and Its Impact on the Internet. And what we did there is we looked at basically what are archetypical types of policies that we see that governments themselves put forward in the name of digital sovereignty. So digital sovereignty is mentioned somewhere in a law or in a policy proposal by governments. We looked at that, and we sort of looked in what corner does this fall. And then we identified sort of 4 different buckets, namely cyber, national, and security law enforcement, competitive and economic protectionism as a second bucket, enhancing user rights and protecting citizens, so sort of user agency questions, and fourthly, safeguarding social and cultural norms and values. So if you look at policy proposals that use the name digital sovereignty, they are in one of those 4 buckets, one could say. Some of those proposals are much more targeted at the individual. Some are more targeted at, the general economic well-being, and some are very state-centric. When we looked at these archetypical types of proposals, then we see that the state-driven proposals that have national security interests, then those are the ones that violate a couple of principles that we set up in a different paper that sort of indicate that if you violate those principles, that leads to internet fragmentation. So the point that I'm making here, which we make in the paper also, is that some policy proposals will lead to fragmentation. And specifically, not necessarily the economic or the ones that focus on individual agency will do that, but the examples that we saw, and those are, let's be honest, also the most obvious examples, China, Russia, where sovereignty and national security goes hand in hand. That is where the principles of the internet are violated. And the principles of the internet we have captured in what we call the internet way of networking. I only have 7 minutes, so I'm not going to explain those principles. But That's what we see. And you know, Russia has proposed this and is actually implementing this. They have said to their ISPs, you have to use our DNS. They have put routing filters in place and made sure that the nation can thrive on its own if it comes to networking, should they be under attack. So those are fragmentary measures. China, similar. We've seen other places where this is introduced. Now, my other point is that if you have fragmentation, that will also lead to cybersecurity issues. Why is that? Well, if you look at the services that we use in the infrastructure, for instance, the way that we use a certificate services, so registration authorities and those that sign certificates. There's a whole trust model with that. And if you want to put your national interests first, then you will introduce laws that put national certificate functions inside of your state. Those national certificate authorities will not be accepted by, for instance, the global browsers. Because if you do, you create a trust issue on the internet. Your traffic might actually be spoofed by that nation state which has that registration authority. Sorry, this might be a little bit technical as an example, but this is the type of thing we're talking about. By introducing fragmentation, the services that we rely on for trust and security functions of the internet itself will be damaged. That could be routing, that could be DNS, that could be certificate authorities, but that could also be in a future, for instance, functions like sign-ins that you use. You know, when you go to a service nowadays, you can often choose to sign in with your own password and username, but you can also log in with, say, a Google account or a Facebook or a GitHub account. And these type of login services become part of the internet infrastructure in some way or form or shape. Should you have fragmentation, then that type of service is not portable anymore across the internet. Similarly, DDoS protection services, feeds of security information might not be reachable when you fragment it off the internet. So my argument here is twofold. National security laws in their strictest forms, national security sovereignty in their strictest forms will lead to fragmentation. At the same time, fragmentation will lead to InfoSec security issues. And with that, I think I kept it to 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Olaf. And before I go to Andrea, let me ask an additional question. So the internet philosophy is based on sharing, and sharing needs trust. You have mentioned it several times. So we had a big trust crisis after the Snowden revelation in 2013, and ISOC was involved in the Montevideo statement and said we have to rebuild trust. This was a key issue. Today, 7, 8 years later, trust is even close to zero. So that means, what is your idea, how we can rebuild trust? Because my understanding, what you have said, is trust is a precondition for cybersecurity. So that means you cannot have cybersecurity without trust.
Trust in what?
That your neighbor is doing, is following the rules and the protocols.
So this is where that question had a deeper meaning. Trust in what? Because I think it's very difficult to give a simple answer to this. If you look at, and I rather use the term trustworthiness, because if something is worthy of trust, that is a sort of provable condition rather than an individual perception. But there are systems on the internet that are not trustworthy. And there are entities on the internet that are not trustworthy to a certain extent. So what we need to do as you know, architects, as stakeholders, as a community, is make sure that we introduce trustworthiness in the systems that together make up the internet. So when I say trust in what, I actually, the underlying statement is there are so many pieces in which we need to incorporate that trustworthiness. And I think if I start brainstorming, I can mention like 15 of them. You really need to understand what you're talking about if you talk about trustworthiness. In the case of the Snowden revelation, for instance, it was clear that there was pervasive monitoring going on the internet, many different places, lots of data was being studied. How do we make sure that that isn't going to happen? And as a result, the community has introduced privacy-enhancing measures that actually have been rolled out between the Snowden revelations and now. The amount of pervasive monitoring that you can do on the internet has decreased in that sense.
Thank you very much. This was a very nuanced answer and helped to clarify issues. Andrea, you have worked together with a lot of governments, United Nations, NATO. What is your take about the dilemmas when we are moving forward?
So I want to start from, Olaf's statement about the digital and security sovereignty. It's definitely a trend. And we have been discussing NIS directive, NIS 2, and the fact that we're using a directive for a problem that is the same in every country is a demonstration that we're not getting it. So, and I was very surprised that today no one mentioned another piece of legislation done by EU that goes exactly in the opposite direction, and that talks about cybersecurity. That is DORA. It has been approved a few days ago, November 10th, by the Parliament, and it talks about cybersecurity. And maybe, what I do for a living is analyzing legislation, but more important, advising governments and companies, on how to improve them. I consider that the best piece of legislation on cybersecurity ever, and, I haven't heard anything today. So that brings me to the joke that the Honorable Bart made this morning. We have 10 different legislations that deal with cybersecurity because maybe we have 10 DGs that, they need to feed the discussion. I don't know. I've never been working for, the institution. I've been working for my Italian government, but I tend to think that thanks to the complexity, that might be an issue. We have 11 packages that are dealing with cybersecurity just in Europe.
Did that include the CRA?
Yes, 11 including the CRA, and they're deeply, deeply connected. And when we talk about NIS 2, not hearing one single time that, most of the principles are going to be enforced in a sector European-wide through DORA, I think it's a message that, unfortunately, this fragmentation is already here. And it's not just a fragmentation in terms of networks, but it's also a fragmentation due to the complexity. You were referring, Wolfgang, to the complexity in technical terms, but the complexity in technical terms leads also in the complexity from a legislative perspective. So all the 11 packages not only are connected, but they support each other. We were discussing before, the Metaverse, and unfortunately I joined late, the discussion. I'm not sure if when talking about ADAS and ADAS 2, we're keeping the Metaverse requirements, the threats that are going to be created by the Metaverse. That is, if I say, so I could recognize Olaf after 12 years, 11 years. We met many times at the ICANN in different corners of the world. Can I recognize him in the Metaverse? No. I can tell you because I cannot recognize my colleagues. 2 weeks ago, I met a lady that I've seen in Teams like 30 times. And I had her for the first time physically in front of me. I could not recognize her. One of the first issues we will have in Metaverse is how can I recognize Olaf? How can I make sure that Olaf is really Olaf? But now, he can wave his hand, and I can use my senses. But what about if there's something between Olaf and myself? A server, a filter not for negative purposes. Just because he wants to look younger or, smoother skin, so you apply filters. You do it on Photoshop, you do it on Facebook, and I have an altered perception of reality. These are the fundamental questions that we find in other pieces of regulations. And I
Andrea, show your tattoo.
I can have a virtual one. I have no tattoos, but in Metaverse, I can look like an hipster and then finally, a new tattoo. So, but going back, who is orchestrating in the complexity of cyberspace, all these interventions? I have a second point that I want to raise. That is about the changing role of governments. And it's more a comment on what I've heard this morning, but it's connected to the points I just raised. I've heard a lot of actions that are going to be on the shoulders of governments, like government agencies and ENISA, and it looks like we're not getting that the cyberspace responds to completely different rules. And maybe it's the time to think about different governance approaches, different metrics. Let me give you an example. eIDAS, it's the regulation on electronic identities and digital. I don't know why they want, no, I know very well why they called it electronic identities and not digital identities, because they were confusing it again with the plastic card. That's an electronic ID. And again, it was a directive and not a regulation, because the ID cards are responsibility of the member states. It cannot be regulated by the union. Now, we all have a digital identity on Amazon, Microsoft, whatever is, one of the global servers. Is that digital identity the same for you and myself? Yes, of course. It doesn't matter if you're Dutch or German or I'm Italian. It's the same digital identity. And the principles that we want to enforce in Europe, are the same. Why not having one single regulation? Because simply that was not recognized as a digital identity. I'm sorry, but that's what we use most in our daily life. When I worked, so for a very brief period of my life, I worked for my government. So all of a sudden, I found myself with a boss that was the prime minister. It was 3 days before Snowden. So I remember very well. We're talking about June 2013. And he asked me a question, Andrea, what do we do in terms of cybersecurity law? And the natural answer was, we can't do anything because of what happened. It's better we keep a low profile. Why don't we do a law on on digital identities? eIDAS was not yet finalized. It would have been finalized just a few months later. So as soon as I've done an assessment of the government capabilities, no way the government was going to be able to manage something technologically so advanced as a digital identity. We went to Estonia, we came to Belgium, we went to UK to see all the different experiences. And at the end, we decided, why don't we interpret the real role of the government, that is protecting the citizens, enabling new services without interfering. So just giving the rules and keeping an eye on the private sector so that they implement digital identities on behalf of the government. That's what happened. We now have, I think, 12 national digital identity service providers. They're all different. You don't like one, you can move to the other. They provide, different sets. The only role that the government has is, of course, to supervise on the security. I was a little bit concerned this morning when I've heard, and this is going to be responsibility of, the incident notification will be sent there, that other national authority will be in charge of that, simply because governments are struggling to attract people, to have the right talent. Even more important, if you rely on the support of the private sector, you can make them an ally. And that's what, we need when, in particular, we want to regulate certain very specific aspects of, the cyberspace. An example, there's I call it an experiment. It's not an experiment. Is the creation of a new country in the Middle East, NEOM. It's defined as a cognitive space. And that's interesting because any policy attempt they're making starts from, this concept. It's not just about the devices and the technologies. It's about the cognitive dimension. I don't care if the routers, the switches, the fiber cables are secure, if I can manipulate information, if I, don't give the right, trustworthy enabling infrastructure. Is just in the beginning, but is a suggestion. Keep an eye on some of the discussions that are going to happen around NEOM. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. What a rich statement. But let me add also a question, direct question to you. 10 years ago, when Bill Clinton was anymore the president of the United States, he came to an ICANN meeting and described the governance of the internet as stumbling forward, stumbling. So that means he said, we have no clue, how to do it. We have to do something. Let's stumbling forward. So when you describe the limits of regulation or the weaknesses, so we have here also a dilemma. On the one hand, we have to do something. As Eleanor has said, there are bad guys and we have to deal with bad guys. On the other hand, what is the illusion? So the relationship between reality and illusion in regulating cyberspace, how you would manage this, let's say, this tensions between realities and illusions.
So first, thank you for reminding me, because I was in that room in San Francisco when at the ICANN, Bill Clinton made that statement. Unfortunately, it's the reality. So we got the foundation of internet, not agreed by governments at all. I mean, Vint Cerf, Bob Kahn, they were not, working, for the government. Governments jump on board later when it was clear that this was such a powerful and an enabling network that had to be, also protected. I'm not sure since governments, got on board that we have been able to make, the same progresses, of course, because it's much more complicated. What I can tell you is I believe in multilateralism. It's important. But I think we need to find new agile ways to come up with pragmatic solutions, because it's simply, taking too long. I've been involved in so many intergovernmental discussions at NATO, at the ITU, at the WSIS, the WIKIT, the renegotiation of ITR. An incredible amount of discussions, amazing topics, amazing arguments, no progresses. So that's something that needs to be fixed.
Okay, thank you. Clement, you have worked with lawmakers now together. You have written a study for the European Parliament. What is your impression? Does the MPs, our MPs here in Europe, do they understand this complexity? And what is your, when you told them about internet fragmentation, so what is your quote-unquote definition? So I just came back from the IGF in Ethiopia, and we had a series of sessions on fragmentation, and there was, at the end of the whole week, was more confusion, because so many different understanding of internet fragmentation, what a splinternet is, what it could be, is it dangerous, is it good, is it very natural? So that means, what is the executive summary of your study, and how do you see the role of the parliamentarians in the European Parliament?
Thanks a lot, Wolfgang, for this very difficult question in the end, and thanks a lot to Lorenzo for the organization of this great summit. So I'm a researcher at CEPS, specialized on digital policies and internet governance. And so today, I would like to briefly give you an outline of this study that we conducted for the European Parliament's TOA panel. On the topic and the renewed debates around this topic of internet fragmentation. So here we will try to address the second dilemma that you mentioned around internet governance. Just to give you an idea of the report, so first we try to address this very contested notion of internet fragmentation. There are different framings, different narrative around the topic of internet fragmentation. Not everybody agrees about what it really means, and hence not everybody has the same policy options and policy recommendations to address this particular topic. So that's the first part of the report. Then we try to look at the different patterns, threats to the internet's unity and interoperability, looking at technical, commercial, and political factors. And then we try to look at the EU, exactly your question, what is the EU doing in this field, and what could be the way forward? And so that's what I will try to address here. And today I wanted to focus more on the factors which could amplify forms of internet fragmentation that relates obviously to cybersecurity. And looking, for instance, at the technical level, obviously we talk about the migration from IPv4 to IPv6, but also to competition at the transport layer that you just mentioned, actually. For instance, with the development and deployment of TLS 1.3, you mentioned the Snowden revelation. It was actually as a result of this revelation that this new security protocol has been developed, with quite a lot of opposition from the banking sector, but also from the US. And so here we try to look also at, as a result of this development and deployment of TLS 1.3 in IETF, how it led to a competing process within ETSI of the ETS security protocol, and we try to reflect on whether this divergence or competition between security protocols at the transport layer can have an impact on the fragmentation of the internet and in the level of security for internet users and businesses. At the technical level, we also look at, a bit in passing, I must say, we look at internationalized domain names and the lack of the universal acceptance of IDNs, which obviously is hindered by the lack, all the cybersecurity challenges that come with the use of scripts without not in Latin. So we try to also mention these technical elements that could drive forms of splintering of the internet, but once again, in the report, we don't really define it as such. We try to map the landscape of definitions, and so we try to take a very broad definition of what is meant by internet fragmentation. And so we look at the technical side, but also at the political level. Obviously, China, Russia come into mind, and with the increasing securitization of internet infrastructure in these countries. But we also look at the EU, and so we mentioned a lot the NIS 2 directive. Today, you are probably very well aware of all the controversies around the inclusion of root name servers within the scope of the directive. Eventually, that's not a policy option that was taken forward, but we argue in the report that it sets a form of precedent that is a bit worrying for internet governance as such. We also look at the DNS for EU initiative. I haven't had the time to listen to all the sessions today, so I don't know to what extent it was mentioned already, but this initiative is part of the new cybersecurity strategy of the EU. And so we try to reflect on whether, once again, this type of initiative could, to some extent, normalize direct intervention into the infrastructure of the internet, and whether or not, well, it could. And you want to follow up already, but we try to reflect on, well, the discourse of the EU and the consistency of its approach when it comes to cybersecurity, but also internet governance. And I'll stop here, and I imagine you already have a comment on that.
I'm actually I'm actually a little bit curious because the DNS for EU part, I talked about this framework that we use to look at fragmentation, and we looked at the DNS for EU proposal and concluded that if it is not mandatory to use DNS for EU, then there are no fragmentation risks. That's sort of the short version of it. And I wonder if you have a different conclusion.
I think technically I would agree with you as long as it's not voluntary, especially as if you look at the technical specification, it's supposed to implement state-of-the-art security protocols, IPv6, DNSSEC, and so on, DOT, DOH. But still, it's more about the discourse and the policy approach towards internet infrastructure that is, we would argue in the report, a bit worrying and conducive to this state-based approach in intervening directly into the infrastructure. So that's our point. It's not technical, it's a bit more discussive.
Yeah, internet fragmentation is an hot issue. If I remember back, I remember the 90s with the alternate route. Then we had ideas from the French government with the object naming system and the DONA from Bob Kahn. Then we had the new IP proposal from China. Now we have the blockchain debate on the internet. So the question is in your study, and then I will go to a question from the floor. If you look into the future, in your study, so what is your expectation? Will the internet be unfragmented as the Declaration on the Future of the Internet has called for? Or do you see it's unavoidable that we move, in 10 years, we will have a fragmented internet?
I don't remember if it's a word of Bill Drake or Milton Muller who said that internet is unifragged. It's both ways, right? I mean, the term of internet fragmentation embeds a paradox in itself. Internet, by definition, is fragmented or distributed into a myriad of autonomous systems. So by definition, it's fragmented. But what we see is true is this form of internet's alignment, to take the word of Milton Muller once again, the bordering of the internet along the national frontiers, and that's what we see in all corners of the world, but including in the EU. And so to come to the very end of the report, so when we try to suggest policy options for the EU, we come with 4 scenarios. First, the status quo, which is, well, not acceptable, let's say. Then it's about embracing fragmentation, so trying to achieve fragmentation because it can also be beneficial for EU interest, fighting at all costs fragmentation, and we see that all these 3 possible options are not really sustainable, let's say. So we come up with a 4th scenario, which is a fragmentation that would be necessary in a democratic society. And so we try to put in the framework human rights, and especially freedom of expression and right to information, as a threshold to accept, to proportionate forms of fragmentation that would be acceptable or not. And so, I advise you to read the report and comment on these options.
Thank you very much. This sounds a very wise conclusion from the debate. Olaf, you want to correct? And then,
No, not correct.
And then I want to get some questions.
Yeah, what you just said, is the overall discourse around internet infrastructure. The fact that NIS2 initially had sections about root servers is an example. Wolfgang and I were both a member of a commission, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, where we looked at norms for interstate behavior in peace and war, so to speak. And one of the norms that we came up with was the protection of the public core. Essentially, the public core being naming, routing, encryption infrastructure, so DNS, IP, and so on and so forth, and numbering, to protect that from interference by state and non-state actors. Those were the words that we were using. And one of the examples, and that goes to making sure that that type of infrastructure is kept out of regulation in essence. And I think that the NIS ended at a good place with respect to that. And another example are the recent asks by the Ukraine government, for instance, to ICANN to say, can you kick .ru out of the root server, which fortunately was pushed back against. And I think that it would be a very good confidence building measure to make sure, and this is in terms of international stability rather than in all kinds of economic policies, to say that organizations that are involved with the distribution of IP addresses, with the organization of the root of the DNS, the centrality of the DNS, and organizations that have to do with standardization and encryption and so on and so forth, are sort of protected in that context from being part of those international disputes and part of war, in order to increase the international stability. I think that's an example of a discourse that is going on.
Thank you very much, and I think this is a very good illustration about the that we have to a nuanced and differentiated approach to this. In the Ukraine case, ICANN was very clear by saying, we support you, we give you 1 million to rebuild your infrastructure, but we are the steward of the public core, and this has to be neutral. So if we allow that the critical resources, what Olaf just described as the public core, be pulled into a conflict, then this is the end of the internet and will to a fragmentation. I always compare this with the, by saying, you know, the DNS and all the protocols are like is the air of the internet, and like in the real world, there is no Chinese air, there is no American air, we have polluted air or clean air. So, and I think this is what ICANN has to do, to keep it clean air, so not to pollute this public core. This is a very delicate issue, so, and it's complex, and policymakers have to understand this. Code makers have to understand what's behind certain policies, but I think it's even important that lawmakers have to understand, you know, how the technology is functioning. But here we had a question. Could you ask the question, please?
Thank you very much for the very interesting and lively discussion. Especially, I have a question. Yeah, how do you see the relation between cyber and information space?
Anybody wants to?
Cyber and information space.
So this is content of information. You mean disinformation and propaganda and campaigning and fake news and all?
Cyber is an artificial definition. We need to look at the impact of deliberate actions or events, and they are deeply interconnected. Let me give you an example. I think this morning one of the incidents against Ukraine, has been, mentioned, the attack to the energy company, actually were for DSOs. And it was the information domain that was mainly used to perform the attack, not just cyber vulnerabilities. There is a big debate. I don't want to, I'm using an easy one, after the Trump elections, and the first hypothesis was, the voting machines have been hacked by the Russians, but then we started reading research papers on the influence, not on the technical side of the voting, but, through the fake news. So because, cybersecurity, the security of the digital space is an unstable balance given by people with their behaviors, the role they play. Of course, they are absolutely totally interconnected. From a regulation perspective, it's not easy to address them together. And the tendency is to keep them completely separate, not because they are, but simply because of the complexity. That's my reading, of course.
There was always a pressure from some governments that you could settle these issues by delegating the responsibilities to the ISPs or the registrars. So that's a very bad idea. So neither ICANN nor the registries or registrars are the content police of the internet. So I think content issues are as old as any communication technology. I think after Gutenberg invented the printing press, the Catholic Church was first excited to bring the Bible, to the Holy Word, to more people, but then they realized this can be used to write pamphlets against the Pope, against the Catholic Church, and they introduced the index of censorship, which was relevant until the 1950s or 1960s. So, and this dilemma, you know, what is right, what is wrong, what is good speech, what is bad speech. So that's a delicate issue which will continue to be a controversial issue for the next 50, 100 years. I do not see any solution. You have to handle this case by case. You have to understand the context, the cultural background, you know, and you cannot leave this in the hand to governments or in the hand of the private sector. So I understand the oversight board from Facebook. It's a good intention, but you cannot leave it, this decision into the hand of private sector. You need a new, innovative, independent judiciary on the global level. So I have no idea, you know, how to build this. But this would be the way forward. So we need innovation in policy making, and the third power next to government and parliament is the independent judiciary. We have to think about it, you know, how we can get more a decentralized system to settle content-related conflicts. So certainly there are some things which everybody agrees. Child porn is just one thing. Here we could have an international convention, but a lot of these issues are really dependent from context, from the culture, from history, from many other things.
Yeah, I have just an additional comment. Let's also be careful about the change in perception due, you know, to the changes in our digital life. And the example is easy. Do we think that our children in 20 years might write the same data protection laws that you know, we started writing in the 90s? They will perceive the same problem as we perceived it, or as we perceive it today, where, you know, 20 years ago, just having a picture of you in swimsuit was, you know, almost a scandal in some countries. And now you go on the internet, you know, how you make money. I just work for OnlyFans, and that's cool. That's normal. You know, you're not ashamed anymore. So the perception of people, because of, you know, the I don't know how to call them, you know, talking about, you know, the fragmentations. We need to make sure that, you know, the internet is connected, but it's already full of fragmentation. I mean, there's full of walled gardens. And in some of these walled gardens, you know, privacy is not an issue anymore. Quite the opposite. The more you share, the more private information, the more that information is sensitive and you share it, the more you're accepted by, you know, that community. And if I'm sure you have been reading this young girl 3 weeks ago, a month ago, that suicided because she has been kicked out by I think it was an Instagram group, and it was the group of friends. You know, she was not disconnected from the internet. She was not closed into a cell. You know, she could still connect with people, but the way she saw the world and the way she's living connectivity, the fact that on one single platform, she had access to Instagram. That's another problem of youngsters that are kicked out by Instagram because of the algorithms, and it's a tragedy for them. But this was not even kicked out from Instagram, but from a group, and for her was the end of the world. Now, this is an extreme case, but I'm using that because, you know, perception and information, they're shaping us. So yes, they're fundamental.
I personally have also problems to delegate content moderation or content correction in the hand of an algorithm, of an AI. Office of the Free Media of the OSCE in Vienna has a project on AI and freedom of expression. It's a very complicated issue, and probably, you know, you have spoken about the metaverse, it gets even more complex. And so, but these are the dilemmas we have to face in the 21st century. So that means we will not find always solutions for the problems. And so far, stumbling forward is not a bad recommendation. More questions from the floor.
I kept my mouth shut during this discussion, but I think my first response when you asked it was, this is a silly question. In information space and cyberspace, how do they relate to each other? Is that they probably both ill-defined? That would have been my answer. But I think that what we did in this discussion was, you know, take some examples, look at details, and I think that is always the case if we talk about cyber. I hate the cyber topic. When somebody invites me to a cybersecurity summit, I tend to say, no, what are we actually talking about? Because it can mean so many things to so many people, just like information security can mean so many things to so many people. Why I respond to this question in this way is that I believe that if we want to have a substantive discussion on the issues that are, the policy issues that are underlying the big questions of our world today, which I understand we capture as being cybersecurity or information security issues, then I think we really have to talk about the individual pieces of what makes together our digital systems and how they relate to each other. What are the trustworthiness issues? What are the interdependencies? What are the supply chains behind them? There's so many things that we can and have to discuss and untangle when we are actually trying to cope with these things. So this is, sorry, that was not meant as wanting to degrade your question. I think it's a good question to reflect on.
Some short final comments, Clement?
Yeah, sure. It was a very limited time to address very complex issues in the end. But I hope, like at least from my presentation, that you can see actually this progressive entanglement of many internet-related issues with military, foreign issues and cybersecurity, and to what extent it can give rise to forms of control and discourses that are more oriented towards state-centered solutions. And I hope, well, to continue this conversation. And hopefully, if you have feedback on the report, I'll be looking forward to hear from you.
Thank you very much. Andrea?
Yeah, based on, you know, on our discussion and also the example you used of the TLS 1.3 and the banks going against that, and the banks were not going against that because they need to comply to another legislation that requires you know, transparency in certain transactions. So I go back to my original point. You know, the cyberspace and its regulation has become incredibly complex. It cannot be addressed in vertical silo, and we need a different way of making policies to secure the cyberspace. That's my point.
Thank you. Smart regulation. Olaf.
I've spoken a lot already, so I'm going to.
Then let me give the final comment. We have 90 seconds to go. Sometimes I have the feeling we are sitting in a canoe moving towards a big waterfall. So what to do? My recommendation would be, don't fight the waterfall. Stabilize the canoe. So we have to go through the waterfall, but we have to make the canoe as stable as possible that we will survive. Thank you very much for your attention, and I give now the micro back to Lorenzo.
So I didn't metamorphose in Lorenzo. It's that Lorenzo had to leave for to catch a plane, and he asked me to actually end this day. So thank you very much to all the panelists, to all the chairs. Thanks to you to come here. We always know that you have plenty of choices here in Brussels to attend meetings that are very, very interesting. So thanks a lot for coming. I bring your attention to the next activities of the Cybersecurity at CEPS initiative. That will be the task force on the intersection between quantum technologies and cybersecurity. So you have the prospectus at the table by the exit. So hopefully we'll see you here in January. In the meantime, have a good festive